The bitter scent of charred wood and melted plastic hung in the night air, creeping into every corner of Redwood Ridge apartments. The distant wail of sirens had receded into memory, replaced by a numbing silence. Yet Oliver Winston could still feel the heat radiating from the blackened skeleton of what was once his neighbor's unit. Even from the far end of the parking lot, where shaken residents huddled together for warmth and solace, he saw the red embers glow like vengeful eyes in the darkness. He rubbed his temples, trying to quell the pounding in his head, but the smell of smoke was unrelenting. It triggered 1,000 anxious thoughts about what-ifs and how it could have been different. A small group of neighbors whispered in frantic circles, and every so often, he heard his name whispered, too. He ignored it for now. The memory of the massive flames leaping from second-floor balcony moments ago still jarred him, its roar echoing even in his mind. Only last week, Redwood Ridge's Homeowners Association, HOA, had made their latest announcement. No personal items on balconies, fire extinguishers included, citing aesthetic uniformity. Oliver recalled the hush that fell over the monthly meeting when Brenda Pilgrim, head of the HOA, had read the rule aloud. There were disapproving looks all around, but no one openly challenged the decision. Even Oliver, who had been an outspoken critic of the HOA's increasingly rigid regulations, had hesitated that night. He could still see Brenda, posture stiff and proud, as though she were the final authority on what belonged in their building's exterior spaces. He thought about the day he first moved in here, just after turning 54, ready for a quieter life after years of living in hectic downtown neighborhoods. Redwood Ridge, with its tall cedar trees and well-maintained lawns, seemed like a peaceful sanctuary. He'd heard rumors of a controlling HOA board, but he'd brushed them aside. How bad could some building guidelines be, after all? As he settled in, though, he realized that Redwood Ridge's HOA was a machine fueled by stringent rules and an obsession with visual harmony. From the color of your window treatments to the plants you kept by the door, everything demanded pre-approval. Until recently, Oliver had taken these draconian rules as a necessary evil, a trade-off for quiet neighbors, a safe environment, and consistently high property values. But the recent spree of policy changes had grown absurd. First, they banned small flower pots on railings because they claimed it diminished property value. Then, they restricted front door decorations during non-holiday periods. And finally, in a move that left many residents puzzled or outright furious, they declared that no personal safety equipment, like fire extinguishers, could be visible on balconies. Why single out fire extinguishers? Oliver had asked Brenda after that meeting, ambushing her on the way to her car. These could save lives in an emergency. Brenda paused, clutching her folder of paperwork. They ruin the visual continuity, she snapped, voice echoing in the near-empty lot. Plus, it could violate certain insurance clauses if used improperly. Oliver had wanted to press further to demand a logical explanation. But Brenda's unwavering stare told him that her decision wasn't up for debate. Send me a written request if you want further discussion, she had finished icily. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Oliver perplexed and unsettled. Now, standing in the smoky aftermath of an actual fire, Oliver seethed with regret that he hadn't pushed harder. He looked up to the second-floor balcony where flickers of dying flames revealed twisted pieces of metal, possibly the remains of an outdoor chair. Had there been a fire extinguisher within arm's reach on that balcony a week ago? Perhaps. And could someone have used it to halt the inferno before it spread? Oliver didn't doubt it. He turned around to check on a cluster of elderly residents waiting near the mailboxes. Among them was Mrs. Laurel, who lived across from the unit that had burst into flames. She clutched at her chest, inhaler in hand, face lined with fear. Age and frail health made her extra vulnerable to smoke. Oliver rushed over, gently laying a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, breath shaky. "It's just my asthma." "The smoke," she coughed. "That poor family." Everything went so fast. Her words made his stomach lurch. He'd been out running errands when the fire broke out and returned to see thick black clouds billowing from the building. By the time the fire trucks arrived, flames had already devoured the balcony and spread into the apartment's living room. Neighbors could do nothing but watch from the parking lot. No one had a working extinguisher on hand. Oliver squeezed Mrs. Laurel's hand. "We'll figure out what happened," he promised, with a conviction that surprised even himself. He had no official standing here, no title or authority. He was just an owner who'd grown tired of living under the iron grip of an HOA that, in his view, had lost its priorities. Overhead, a flicker of lightning illuminated the charred building. Rain began to patter, too late to quell the flames that had done their worst. With the crowd dispersing and the fire department wrapping up, Oliver knew life at Redwood Ridge would never be the same. However, he also knew that, for many, tonight's tragedy would open questions about the cost of aesthetic perfection, questions about why vital safety tools have been banned, and, most piercing of all, questions about who would bear responsibility for what had gone so terribly wrong. Though uncertain of what lay ahead, Oliver felt a quiet resolve take shape in his chest. He would confront Brenda Pilgrim and her board of enforcers. He would ensure that this heartbreak didn't just become a footnote lost to bureaucracy. And if the HOA thought they could hide behind their usual procedures, they were in for a rude awakening. 2 days after the fire, the Redwood Ridge Community Center bustled with an energy that bordered on hysteria. The HOA had called an emergency meeting to address recent events. Folding chairs formed crooked rows across the beige-tiled floor, and every seat was filled. Residents stood along the walls or peered in through the open doors. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed steadily, underscoring the tension. At the front of the room sat the 4 board members. Brenda Pilgrim, wearing a conservative navy blazer, flanked by 3 other middle-aged residents who rarely spoke unless it was to echo her opinions. A protective fortress of paperwork stacked on the table in front of them. Spread across the board members' faces was a cocktail of impatience, discomfort, and simmering defiance. Oliver arrived early to grab a front-row seat. He looked around at the anxious faces and recognized a swelling frustration. Harold Moore, a retired electrician who once tried to argue that exterior light fixtures should be replaced with energy-efficient LEDs, wore a scowl so deep it looked etched in stone. Next to him, Linda Santos fiddled with a manila folder, presumably full of photos or documents she hoped would support her argument for reversing the ban on balcony storage. A faint cough from the back indicated Mrs. Laurel was present too, though she remained partially hidden behind the crowd. Brenda tapped a microphone, her nails clicking. "Order, please," she said in a clipped tone. Despite her attempt at composure, the microphone squealed, prompting a small wave of murmurs. "We're here to discuss the unfortunate incident earlier this week. Let me first say that the Redwood Ridge HOA extends its sympathies to those affected." An uncomfortable silence fell. Everyone knew the family who lost their unit was now living with relatives, mourning not only the destruction of their home, but the loss of their beloved cat, which succumbed to smoke inhalation. No one knew how to bring that up, or if they should. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have called this meeting to clarify the reason behind our balcony policy. There have been allegations that the ban on personal items, particularly fire extinguishers, somehow exacerbated the situation." "Allegations?" Oliver said, loud enough to draw eyes his way. He could feel his pulse quickening, but he held himself tall in his folding chair. "That's quite a passive term to describe what we all witnessed." Brenda's gaze snapped toward him. "Mr. Winston, I'll ask you to respect the process. We'll have open commentary once the board has finished its initial statement." Oliver clenched his jaw but remained silent for now. Brenda cleared her throat. The board's policy was formed after consultation with Redwood Ridge's insurance provider. "We have documentation stating that improperly stored fire extinguishers may lead to claims denials if misused." An outburst erupted among the residents. "That's nonsense. Who told you that? And what about a real emergency?" flew around the room. Brenda's repeated demands for order only magnified the uproar. The tall, bespectacled man next to Brenda, Mark, the HOA secretary, fumbled with a paper. Technically, The policy says that any items visible on a balcony that do not meet HOA standards can be subject to removal. He looked around awkwardly. It's not specifically about extinguishers alone. Oliver stood up, but you effectively ban them by name, stating that they're unsightly and potentially hazardous if used by someone untrained. Is that correct? The corner of Brenda's eye twitched. Yes. The presence of personal fire extinguishers is not recommended by our insurer. If used incorrectly, a person could worsen the fire or harm themselves, leaving Redwood Ridge liable. A wave of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Even Mark shifted uncomfortably, and the other board members seemed relieved they weren't the ones speaking. Linda Santos rose, waving a photograph. Last summer, there was a small kitchen flare-up in my apartment. My nephew used a fire extinguisher to put it out before it spread. No injuries, no big insurance claims. This is proof that having one handy can save more than just property. Harold chimed in, voice gruff, and we're not kids. I serve in the military, for crying out loud. We know how to read instructions and pull a pin. It's not advanced rocket science. Cheers of agreement echoed. Brenda scowled, struggling to regain control. While we understand your concerns, Redwood Ridge must operate under policies that benefit the majority. The building is equipped with fire alarms and sprinklers in compliance with local codes. Personal extinguishers on balconies are not mandatory by any ordinance. We're not the only HOA to have this rule. Oliver was about to argue further when a frail voice rose from behind him. What if the sprinklers malfunction? Mrs. Laurel shuffled forward, leaning on her cane. During the fire the other night, the sprinklers didn't activate until the flames were already roaring into the living room. A hush followed. Everyone had heard rumors that the sprinklers were out of date or in need of maintenance. Brenda's face reddened slightly, and she flipped through her papers. The system meets the minimum local safety requirements, Brenda insisted. But minimum isn't enough, Oliver countered, stepping forward. Not when it concerns the lives of everyone here. We need real safety measures. The balcony rule is misguided, maybe even dangerous. We just saw firsthand what can happen. More murmurs of agreement rose, and some nodding heads turned to glare at the board. Brenda's voice threatened to crack as she raised the microphone again. The board will reevaluate the policy, but we're also dealing with potential liability and significant insurance constraints. We request that you submit all comments and concerns in writing within 5 business days. Oliver felt frustration bubble over. 5 business days? People's lives are at stake here. You want us to play bureaucratic hopscotch while you hide behind insurance clauses. Brenda pursed her lips, ignoring Oliver's barb. We are not adjourned, but we will not tolerate disrespectful language. This is a reminder to everyone. Redwood Ridge is a community guided by civility and order. Civility and order. As though they were the end-all, be-all of living here. Oliver caught Linda Santos rolling her eyes. Several folks in the back stood up, mumbling about how the meeting was a waste of time, that the board was stonewalling the very people they were meant to represent. Despite the tension, Oliver refused to back down. As the meeting dragged on with procedural statements and vague assurances, he made a vow to himself. He would get to the heart of this ban. More importantly, he would do whatever it took to prevent another tragedy from ravaging Redwood Ridge. By the end of the meeting, the board was no closer to lifting the ban. Residents shuffled out, their anger and fear still raw. Outside, Oliver stood in the drizzling rain with Harold and Linda, strategizing a plan. They couldn't force the board to act right away, but they could push from below, rally community support, gather evidence about the HOA's flawed policies, and make enough noise to get the attention of local authorities if needed. Looking up at the dimly lit apartments, Oliver felt a pang of worry. Another fire could happen any time, triggered by something as ordinary as a frayed wire or a neglected candle. And until the rules changed, Redwood Ridge might be just one spark away from another disaster. In the days following the stormy HOA meeting, Redwood Ridge was abuzz with quieter but determined activity. Neighbors were talking, forging alliances, and, most importantly, circulating a petition to rescind the balcony ban. Oliver led much of the charge, coordinating door-to-door visits with Linda, Harold, and a few other dedicated residents. "It's not just about extinguishers," Harold explained during one such canvass. "They shouldn't be able to micromanage every inch of our living space and hide behind insurance talk. It's bullying, plain and simple." Word spread about the proposed changes. Some people were indifferent or too tired to take on the HOA, but the memory of the recent fire, plus a desire for basic autonomy, galvanized many to sign. Still, Oliver noticed that fear lingered. Brenda and her associates had a reputation for sending warning letters or fines to dissenters. No one wanted to jeopardize their standing or their property values. Despite these challenges, Oliver's circle of activists grew. Among them was a new resident, Tanya Rowe, a retired school administrator with a backbone of steel. She'd already had a run-in with the HOA over her balcony wind chimes, which Brenda claimed were noisy. Tanya had refused to remove them, incurring daily fines until she eventually replaced them with a quieter set. "I'll be damned if they scare me into compliance," she said firmly, penning her signature on the petition in a forceful stroke. While the activism was in full swing, Oliver kept his eyes on the building's infrastructure. Early one morning, he spotted a maintenance worker from a contracted company fiddling with the corridor sprinklers on the third floor. Oliver approached, introduced himself, and asked about the system status. The worker shrugged. "Honestly, it's old. The landlord or the HOA would need to invest in an upgrade. We just replace the heads and run monthly checks. But if the water pressure's not up to snuff or the pipes corroded over the years, that's a big problem." This conversation weighed heavily on Oliver. Redwood Ridge boasted a well-manicured exterior, but behind the polished veneer lurked neglected systems that could fail at a moment's notice. He began collecting information about building codes and the recommended lifespan of sprinkler systems. Meanwhile, tensions with the HOA board ramped up. Official letters started arriving at the doors of vocal petitioners. The letters, stamped with the Redwood Ridge HOA logo, cited community standards and threatened fines for disseminating incorrect or inflammatory materials. Linda showed Oliver one such letter, hands trembling with anger. "They're trying to muzzle us," she fumed. "But we won't back down." Oliver nodded. "Let them try. We'll keep everything documented and, if needed, go to the city's housing authority." In the midst of this, Redwood Ridge found itself on the brink of another potential crisis. A neighbor, Jonathan Reese, stored painting supplies and solvents in a small closet on his balcony. This was known to a few folks, though it wasn't exactly legal under the building's guidelines. Jonathan was a local artist who lacked space inside his one-bedroom apartment, so he kept his flammables locked away outside. Several neighbors worried that if a stray spark or a carelessly discarded cigarette landed near Jonathan's supplies, the result could be catastrophic. One afternoon, Oliver decided to speak with Jonathan privately. "I'm not trying to police your space," he began, mindful of how the HOA's usual intrusiveness might make Jonathan suspicious. "I'm just worried about safety. Would you consider storing the solvents somewhere else? Or at least picking up a specialized container?" Jonathan frowned, setting down a paintbrush. His living room reeked of turpentine and acrylics. "Look, I get it, but I'm on a fixed income, and renting a separate studio or storage is out of the question." He sighed, fatigue etched into his face. "I'll see about a proper container, but the HOA's rules are nuts. They won't let me keep a small fire extinguisher, but I can't afford to store these materials off-site either." "Catch 22, right?" Oliver nodded sympathetically. "I hear you. Just be careful, okay? We already had one fire." Jonathan promised to buy a metal storage chest. While it wasn't a perfect solution, it was at least a step towards safety. In an attempt to gather more support, Oliver organized a small weekend gathering at Redwood Ridge's modest recreation area by the pool, a place the HOA didn't mind people congregating, as long as it looked socially appealing for prospective buyers. He set up a folding table with coffee and pastries, hoping to draw in curious residents. Then he and Linda, along with Harold and Tanya, laid out documents about fire safety codes, best practices for extinguishers, and estimates on how much an HOA liability insurance rider might cost if they permitted balcony extinguishers. A small crowd trickled in. Some came for the coffee, some for the sense of community. A hush fell when Mrs. Laurel ambled up, came tapping lightly on the concrete. She quietly relayed her experiences from the night of the fire, describing the panic, the uselessness of waiting for emergency services when every second counted. If even one person had had an extinguisher handy, perhaps we could have slowed that fire. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, no one spoke. It was in that moment of silence that Oliver felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, Redwood Ridge faced bureaucratic obstinacy, but the residents weren't powerless. Neighbors supported each other. Shared tragedy galvanized them. As the conversation picked up again, Oliver found himself quietly encouraged. Of course, the board wouldn't just roll over. Midway through the gathering, an HOA representative strolled by. Sandra Crane, one of Brenda's loyal sidekicks. She eyed the leaflets on the table with thinly veiled contempt. "Are you authorized to host a meeting in the common area?" she asked, arms crossed. Oliver refused to flinch. "This isn't an official meeting, Sandra. It's just neighbors talking. Last I checked, that's allowed." Sandra sniffed. "As long as there's no unsanctioned signage or distribution of materials that misrepresent Redwood Ridge policy." She let her words hang ominously. Then she turned on her heel and left. "That's the problem right there," Tanya muttered. "They're always on patrol, waiting to swoop in." Oliver folded his arms. "Well, let them. We're not doing anything wrong. And the more they push us, the more we know we're onto something important." By the end of the day, Oliver's group had more signatures on the petition and a growing sense of solidarity. But they also knew they were operating against a ticking clock. Redwood Ridge's aging electrical systems, potential lapses in sprinkler maintenance, Jonathan's flammable paints. Any number of accidents could trigger another blaze. And with every day the balcony ban remained in effect, the residents lacked a first line of defense. Night fell, and Oliver walked home feeling a mixture of triumph and dread. If the HOA refused to listen, how far would the conflict escalate? And if another disaster ignited, could Redwood Ridge ever recover? It happened on a humid Tuesday night. Most residents were indoors, air conditioners rattling against the thick summer air. Oliver had been in bed early, reading over a stack of local fire safety guidelines, a flashlight in hand so as not to disturb the rest of the apartment's dim tranquility. He was drifting off when a sudden pop jolted him awake, like a distant firecracker, but too close for comfort. A second pop followed, then faint screaming. Adrenaline surged through Oliver. He rushed to his window and peered outside. At first, he couldn't discern anything amiss, until a flicker of orange caught his eye near the east wing of the complex. A chill shot down his spine. Memories of the previous fire flooded back. He yanked on jeans and a t-shirt, then ran out into the hallway. The acrid smell of burning chemicals assaulted his nostrils as soon as he opened his front door. Panicked voices echoed from above. He bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring his own trembling limbs. On the third-floor landing, thick black smoke oozed from beneath the door of Jonathan Reese's apartment. Oliver's heart sank. Those solvents. A gag reflex kicked in as the fumes flooded his lungs. He fumbled for his phone, dialing 911, breath ragged with urgency. "This is Redwood Ridge Apartments. We have a fire on the 3rd floor," he gasped into the receiver. "Send help immediately." He cut the call short and pounded on Jonathan's door. "Jonathan, are you in there?" No answer, just the ugly hiss of the growing flames. He tested the doorknob, but yanked his hand back instantly. It was scorching hot. Down the hallway, a few disoriented neighbors emerged from their units, coughing. One man tried to approach with a kitchen extinguisher he'd grabbed from inside, but the hallway was already filling with so much smoke that getting close to the door was treacherous. Oliver attempted to guide people down the stairs, urging them to exit the building. "Everyone get out now," he shouted, voice strained. "Don't use the elevator, take the stairs." Amid the chaos, Mrs. Laurel appeared at the far end of the corridor, confused and struggling to breathe. Oliver raced to her. "Come on, we need to get you outside," he pleaded, but she wheezed in protest, disoriented by the stinging haze. Just then, a boom rattled the walls. A flash of fire ripped through Jonathan's front window, spraying shattered glass onto the balcony. Flames licked the exterior, leaping toward the roof. Oliver steadied Mrs. Laurel, guiding her firmly toward the stairwell. The corridor lights flickered ominously, and he could hear screams from below as more people discovered the emergency. Overhead sprinklers finally kicked in, raining stale water onto the hallway floor. It was better than nothing, but with a chemical-driven blaze, the flames were spreading rapidly. Oliver's eyes burned, and each breath felt like swallowing nails, but adrenaline fueled him. They descended flight after flight of stairs until they burst into the ground-level lobby. At the entrance, a cluster of frightened residents huddled, eyes wide with shock. The wail of distant sirens brought a glimmer of relief, but it felt like an eternity before the first fire truck arrived. Outside, the East Wing's top floor was engulfed, embers drifting into the night sky. Firefighters leaped into action, unrolling hoses, yelling instructions. Oliver helped Mrs. Laurel sit on a curb and urged a paramedic to check her out. He then scanned the crowd for Jonathan. He eventually found him, clad in paint-stained pajama bottoms, stumbling out a side entrance with tears streaming down his sooty face. He mumbled over and over, "I was asleep. I didn't know my balcony." A fearsome wave of guilt crashed over Oliver. He remembered their conversation about the paint supplies. He'd warned Jonathan, but neither had truly prevented the potential catastrophe. Now, it was playing out in real time, a living nightmare. Brenda Pilgrim and two other board members arrived shortly after, looking disheveled. Brenda appeared panicked, her veneer of control obliterated by the surreality unfolding around them. She darted around, trying to talk to the fire chief, who kept brushing her off to manage the crisis at hand. Through the roaring flames and the frantic flurry of rescue operations, Oliver noticed something else. At least 3 balconies had charred remains of fire extinguishers on them. Despite the official ban, some residents had quietly defied the rule. But in this intense blaze, smaller extinguishers were no match for the chemical-laden inferno that had grown so quickly. Hours passed like a slow-motion horror film. The firefighters managed to contain the fire before it spread further, but the damage was extensive. Jonathan's apartment was gutted. The units on either side were scorched by invading flames. Water had drenched everything in the floors below, turning hallways into shallow rivers. By dawn, the immediate crisis had subsided. The building was evacuated, with residents scattered to hotels or friends' couches. Oliver slumped against a fire truck, soot streaking his arms. Exhaustion clung to every cell in his body, but an even heavier weight pressed on him. The knowledge that this second tragedy might have been preventable, or at least minimized, if Redwood Ridge's leadership had listened. Ambulances whisked away a handful of residents suffering from smoke inhalation. Jonathan was among them, though his injuries weren't life-threatening. In a haze, Oliver watched Brenda Pilgrim pace near a cluster of reporters who had arrived to cover the event. She appeared rattled, forced to answer difficult questions about the HOA's controversial ban. This time, the entire fiasco was unfolding under a media spotlight. Oliver could almost hear the click of cameras capturing the blackened balconies that, ironically, had been so crucial to Redwood Ridge's uniform aesthetic. He thought about the heartbreak of the families who'd lost their homes, the fear that would linger in everyone's minds. As the sun rose, painting the sky in muted pinks and grays, Oliver stared at the fire chief, who was packing up gear. The man, sweaty and grim-faced, approached Oliver briefly. "Neighbor told me about your petition. Doesn't make sense, banning extinguishers for aesthetics. Some folks just don't get it until it's too late." Oliver nodded, throat too tight for words. He gazed at the scorched facade, imagining how quickly fate could change when safety was sidelined for superficial concerns. Once again, Redwood Ridge stood silent, marked by black scars, a testament to the night's devastation. Morning light revealed the full scope of destruction. Portions of the East Wing were uninhabitable, windows shattered, balconies marred by deep char marks. Dozens of residents wandered the parking lot, some weeping, others simply dazed. News vans parked haphazardly near the entrance, journalists clamoring for statements. The atmosphere felt surreal to Oliver. He'd spent the last few hours helping paramedics carry supplies, calming hysterical neighbors, and giving a brief statement to the police about what he'd witnessed. Exhaustion draped over him like a heavy cloak, but he pressed on. He knew the worst was yet to come. The questions, the insurance nightmares, and the finger-pointing. By mid-morning, a city inspector arrived, shaking his head as he documented the damage. In hushed tones, Oliver overheard him remark to a colleague that Redwood Ridge had multiple compliance issues and outdated safety measures. The comment cemented Oliver's resolve. He found Linda, Harold, and Tanya near the cluster of displaced residents. They stood solemnly, hugging a tearful neighbor who'd lost nearly everything. When they caught sight of Oliver, they beckoned him over. "Oliver," Linda started, glancing warily at the news crews. "Reporters keep asking about the HOA's ban and our petition. They want interviews." Harold nodded. "We can't hide from this. The world deserves to know the truth, how these rules might have contributed to a second fire." Oliver's eyes flickered toward the building. "You're right. We need to be honest. We need to hold the HOA accountable. I'm done worrying about stepping on toes." A minute later, they found themselves standing in front of a local news camera. The reporter, a serious-looking woman with a neat bob haircut, introduced herself as Sandra Blake. She held out a microphone, her expression sympathetic but focused. "We're here with residents of Redwood Ridge, where a second devastating fire has occurred. There are claims the HOA banned essential fire safety equipment from Balconies. Mr. Winston, can you comment on that?" Oliver inhaled, fighting a swirl of emotions. "Yes, the HOA has enforced strict rules that prohibit any personal items, specifically fire extinguishers, from being visible on balconies. Many of us believe that policy contributed to the speed and severity of these fires." "And you started a petition?" Sandra prompted, her gaze shifting to Linda and Harold, who nodded. "Yes," Linda said. "We've collected signatures from numerous residents, asking to overturn the ban. Fire extinguishers are a basic safety measure, certainly not something to regulate out of existence because they're unsightly." Harold chimed in, arms folded protectively. "We're not naive. We know an extinguisher can't solve every fire, but it can help buy time, save lives, reduce damage. When you consider Redwood Ridge's aging infrastructure and other potential hazards, every second counts." The reporter nodded solemnly, then turned back to the camera. "We've requested a statement from the HOA, but as of now, they've declined to comment." Live from Redwood Ridge Apartments, I'm Sandra Blake. As the cameraman lowered his equipment, Oliver released a shaky breath. Around them, residents who had overheard the interview began murmuring in quiet agreement. A few even approached, thanking them for speaking up. Near the back of the crowd, Brenda Pilgrim stood rigid, arms crossed over her chest. Oliver could practically see the fury and embarrassment swirling behind her eyes. For a moment, she looked poised to march over, but something in Oliver's determined expression must have warned her off. She stalked away, phone pressed her ear. Over the following hours, city officials roped off the damaged area, and a flurry of phone calls and paperwork ensued. Representatives from a local relief organization arrived to help displaced families find temporary lodging. Volunteers distributed bottled water and blankets. Amid the chaos, Redwood Ridge's once immaculate landscaping was trampled, symbolic of how little the old priorities mattered now. Late in the afternoon, Oliver was sitting on a low concrete wall, resting his aching feet, when a familiar figure approached. Jonathan Reese, still smelling faintly of smoke and disinfectant, lowered himself gingerly onto the wall. He had bandages on his arms and a haunted look in his eyes. "Hey," Oliver greeted softly. "How are you holding up?" Jonathan rubbed his forehead. "Alive, and incredibly sorry. The fire started in my balcony closet, I guess. Some old rags soaked in paint thinner spontaneously combusted." He swallowed hard. "I should have known better." Oliver placed a reassuring hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You didn't set out to cause a disaster. The conditions were just right for something like this to happen. And that's on all of us, This building isn't exactly set up to handle fires. The rules haven't helped. Jonathan let out a shaky breath. I lost all my work, though. Every painting, every canvas. But if someone else had died because of me, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. It's a miracle no one did. But now we have to make sure this never happens again, Oliver said firmly, looking over at the still smoking rubble. In the days that followed, the Redwood Ridge HOA found itself under intense scrutiny. City inspectors demanded upgrades to the fire systems. The local news ran multiple segments on the ban that cost Redwood Ridge dearly, featuring interviews with safety experts who criticized the HOA's stance. Facing public pressure and potential legal action from both tenants and insurance companies, the board hurriedly convened and, at last, voted to rescind the balcony ban on fire extinguishers and other safety devices. But for many residents, the gesture came too late. Lawsuits were being filed. Trust in the HOA was shattered. Some residents moved out, unwilling to live in a place that had proven so indifferent to their well-being. Others stayed to see through the changes, determined to rebuild Redwood Ridge into a safer, more cooperative community. Oliver, exhausted but resolute, led volunteer efforts to gather and distribute fire safety literature, coordinate training sessions, and push for a total overhaul of the building's sprinkler and electrical systems. He and a new wave of residents planned to run for board positions in the next HOA election. If Redwood Ridge had a future, it would be one shaped by a commitment to genuine community, not superficial perfection. One quiet evening, as Oliver helped Mrs. Laurel carry groceries to her temporary unit, she paused to look at the tangle of construction scaffolding around the building. "We survived," she said softly, tears shining in her eyes. "But dear God, let's never forget what got us into this mess." Oliver nodded, remembering the nights he'd spent haunted by flames that could have been quenched sooner. "We won't," he promised. "Sometimes it takes a tragedy to wake people up, and we're wide awake now." The end.